joining me today is the amazing real food activist, whole food and natural chef, Jude. Hi.
Hello, Alex.
How are
Thank you
you?
so much for having me
Oh,
here.
I'm
I feel
so
like I'm in
excited.
your home.
Yeah, the last time we saw each other, you cooked the best breakfast that Sebastian still remembers.
God, what did
In
I cook? It probably
You did. You just did an omelette and some sticky black rice with
Oh, I
mango. But
did. Yeah,
you
yeah, but it's
honestly,
hard to beat sticky black rice and omelette, isn't
I
it?
think it
Not
made
together,
a
everybody, but
huge impression on
at
that
the
little
table.
4-year-old's mind. Yeah. So we're obviously here because of Real Food Rockstars, and what I love about what this course is doing is it's not prescribing anything. I don't have a meal plan. We're not telling anyone they have to eat a certain way. It is about rediscovering ourselves as our number one health practitioner, listening to us and our bodies. And I know that you are absolutely on that wavelength as well, which is why it is perfect to have you here with us. Can you share how you got to be the instigator of the whole food movement in Australia? What took you to that point? It's a pretty big. I know I'm making a big call, but you did.
Uh, well, that's very lovely of you. Thank you. And I sometimes feel like I did. But I think it sums it up is I'm a Sagittarian on a mission. Or else Sagittarians tend to think they know better than everybody else.
I have
And
no
so
idea what you're talking about.
so we tend to just take it and run with it.
Mm.
Look, I think that it's really important to understand that I grew up with a lot of real food. My mum was a nurse.
Yeah.
She also was Italian. So there you have it all, basically.
Yeah.
We had real food at home. My mother was very interested in healing, and I grew up with a real passion for healing. Really, probably in my time, if I had have had the option and access to be a doctor, that's probably what I would have done. But I didn't have that access in the late 60s or even the early 70s, even though women's lib was coming in. You still really had the options of teaching or something else, and I did early childhood education. So they were really my passions, but I think it was probably heralded and channeled a little bit more towards that kind of natural kind of side, for want of a better word. When I was in my very early 20s, I was diagnosed with severe endometriosis, and I had had a shocking teenage years. I mean, yeah, pain was just a constant friend. And I think that kind of channeled me towards searching for something else. And that's how I got into it. And I was actually, after early childhood education, I actually didn't do that for very long. I hated it. And I ended up in the fashion industry. I was a fashion designer and love that to this day. You wouldn't think it to look at me most of the time.
Yeah.
But
Jude, I'm going to be highly unorthodox here. I know your story, and I've had a knock at the door for a parcel I've been waiting for all day. Can you keep sharing it with the interwebs?
Absolutely,
Awesome.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. And parcels at the door are very exciting and important. Hey, so what was I saying? So what happened for me then was that as the years went on, I still had this passion for nutrition, so I started studying nutrition part-time. And was very disillusioned with what I was coming across, and I understand that now. And as it happened in the mid-80s, it might have been early 80s, I can't remember now, I went to the US and I came across a book that had just been published by Anne-Marie Colburn called Food and Healing. And it was like, the US is a very powerful place for me. It was like, the universe takes over your life at a few points in your life, and that was one. And it just, within that day, I knew that I was coming back to Australia, getting out of the fashion industry, giving up nutrition. It was bullshit. And I did that and came back to Australia and did that. And my daughter and I went and lived in the US. And I studied what you do study at that time, which was macrobiotics. So that's where I started. And that was the start of my journey.
How amazing. And if you could share some thoughts, it might be obvious to a lot of people, but there are a lot of naysayers, there are a lot of people resisting, there are a lot of, oh, well, our parents are still alive and my mum smoked while she was pregnant and I'm fine, but, we're not fine generally if we really look at it. Why you believe the role of whole foods is so integral and is the way forward?
I think that's quite a complex question because it's whole food is much more than just simply about food being closer to its natural state. It's about looking after a whole ecosystem, but it's actually living a whole life as well. And it's really interesting, that aspect of our parents living older. I mean, my mum is 95 and most of her generation are that age. They're moving on now. And I think the thing that I'm coming back to more, because I've done the circle, I've done the extremes, the raw, the paleo of their day back in the 80s.
Yeah.
And I feel quite centred where I am now. And I think some of the big things why those women or those people live longer lives, even if they smoked for some of them, there are a lot of things going on that they did a lot better than we're doing now. Our soil was far more nutrient dense. It had more mineral goodness to it. It's absolutely bastardised now, and a lot of that is lost. Chemical farming was only in its early days. Food was fresh. And fresh doesn't mean fresh from a cool room where it sat for 6 months. It's actually as close as possible to harvest where life force is still really intact. And life force will often translate as nutrient density as well.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that's a critical thing. When they were preserving in traditional methods, bottling, drying, lactofermentation, blah, blah. Gut health was far better. They had very limited exposure to antibiotics in those days. Having said that, my mum's life was saved when she was 18 by trials of antibiotics because they were that new. But they hadn't been absolutely awash with them. They played in dirt. I think other things that were really important is they worked physically hard. We tend not to do that now. They had a lot of physical exercise. They didn't go to gyms. I'm not a gym fan. They were in touch with nature. They did their work with nature. Walking. My mum walked kilometres to school and back every day. We rode all around the neighbourhood left, right and centre when we were little kids. We had to run and catch our chicken if we were going to eat chicken, that kind of thing. But the other thing, and the thing that I'm beginning to think is probably more important than anything else that we are seeing in those older generations and why people got away with things like smoking and even having white sugar and white flour, they were far less stressed and they were the nuclear family and the support systems were far more intact than they are now. And I just think this is a fascinating thing. Interestingly, I was reading an amazing article by my favourite doctor, Thomas Cowan, who's a Western-trained doctor based in the US. He's actually on the board of the Western Price Foundation, but he's also anthroposophically trained. And anthroposophy is Rudolf Steiner's spiritual kind of / philosophical medical system. And he's talking about new studies about heart attack and where it's pointing to, as his firm belief, is stress.
Yeah.
And the stress changing the entire biological system. And that's what they're seeing in heart attacks, which fits with a lot of what I understand about heart attacks as well.
Absolutely, and funnily you should mention that.
Push yourself. At the gym, push.
In a couple of days' time, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Stephen Sinatra, who was the author of The Great Cholesterol Myth. I've had a fantastic chat to him.
He'll probably have great info. It's a very interesting area. So, I think it's not just as simple as it's quite complex, but on the other hand, yes, it is quite simple. But I think those issues, I forgot the original question now, but I think they're some of the things that really matter.
You answered the question. We're all good.
Right.
Yeah. Now, a challenge that a lot of people have is those hectic days, the quick go-to filling staff for big people and little people. There's quite a few singles, couples doing this course, not just families.
Yeah.
What can you recommend for people, because we've been told for so many decades, at least a good 4 decades now, that we need the convenience of the food industry. we need to start telling ourselves, obviously, that we don't. And for the people at the very beginning of their journey, what's a little pearl of wisdom you can help them start to believe that they're going to be able to do this?
The pearl of wisdom that I would say, and that I would also preliminary that, it's probably not a word in that context, but I would probably precurse that to, can I say to you that you are not probably going to be able to do it all. And we're all, well, not me so much, but probably a lot of the younger generation from 45 downwards are the recipients of the generation that you can have it all and you can do it all. I do not believe that you can do it, and I say that to you as an absolute women's liver back in the 70s. It had a lot to offer, but there was a lot of myths and untruths. You cannot do it all. And the thing that is giving in society at the moment is the food that we eat. And I had something on mine there, it's gone. So I would precurse it with that. And because I'm a Sagittarian, I'm always this intense and deep and meaningful person, really what you're talking about in the end. And I will give you the pearl of wisdom, and there are ways around that you can do it. But fundamentally, you need to look at your life and decide what's important in your life. And I promise you this, as a mother and as an early childhood teacher, which I still have a huge amount of interest in, your child is not going to be benefited by running them around to every different after-school activity, music, dance, swimming, especially in winter when it's darker and colder. And you need to look at what really matters in your life time-wise and simplify your lives. That's what I'd say first of all. But otherwise, so the topic would that be was how to make whole food a workable part of your everyday life. And the number one way is you need to be organised. But can I say, and just step back a little bit further, the prime thing that I would say to you, if you are just starting out, is that be prepared and accept that it's going to be a 2 to 5 year journey. And I see hundreds of people over the years that come in freaked out, and the worst thing you can do is try and do it all and learn it all and know it all straight away. Take it a step at a time. Really, working out where to buy things and where to buy the kind of food that you want, at a better price, closer to harvest, blah, 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 can take you a year. And in Perth, where I am, you get it all sussed out in a year and then it all changes. So even doing that, it's understanding how certain ingredients behave, like when you're going to start using ingredients closer to their natural state, or more real versions, so real versions of a soy sauce, real versions of mirin, or real versions of a starchy cornstarch, for example, i.e. kuzu. Those things behave differently. Grains closer to their natural state behave differently. Wholemeal flour behaves very differently to white standardised wheat flour. And my advice is take it slow, bite off one chunk at a time, let's say legumes, and work with that until you're comfortable with it. But what I will promise you is that it gets easier as you go, and that everybody gets it. And people come back to me in 5 years and go, oh, my God, yeah, I got that in there. And it gets easier, and it's like learning to drive a car, like the beginning is terrifying.
Yeah.
Because to learn anything takes space in your brain. Your nerves are building that kind of knowledge. And when you drive a car, you freaked out. I remember doing hill starts. It's just traumatizing, and it takes so much energy to work through it. But 10 years later, or even 5 years later, you're driving, you're yelling at the kids in the back, you got the radio on, and it's a skill. It's a bit like, Jamie says cooking's not rocket science. Well, it's not, but it's a skill, and learning where to get these things, etc., takes time. So I would say be gentle on yourself. Take one step at a time.
Yeah, beautiful. I really wish you were there for me 7 years ago when I started.
Be hairy, can't it?
Listening to that, no, but it's true. It is a 2 to 5 year journey for it to
is.
start to become instinct.
Absolutely.
For you to start to just be able to wash over a list of ingredients and go bam, bam, bam. No, thank you.
Absolutely.
You know, it really is a journey. So that's
and you get it. Everybody gets it. It just takes time.
And this might be a 20-day course, but it's a springboard to the journey. It's
20-day course and months to kind of digest it and think about it.
That's it.
Yeah, which is how it should be.
Yeah, beautiful. So you mentioned a little bit about flour then. Can you talk us through white wheat flour in its modern processed form?
Oh, I'd love to, because this is leading into one of my favourite topics is wheat is evil, gluten is evil, which I totally disagree with.
Okay, yeah.
I think that what we're seeing now is with wheat, yes, it has been hybridised. Yes, there are issues with that, with the gluten in it. But to be honest, when you see, for me, the problem for me is I am a child of that era. Yeah, and I have seen people, we grew up with white flour and white sugar, you know, because that's what there was. My mum grew up with it, and everybody I know of that generation, happy and healthy. My dad's not alive now because he was 25 years older than my mum. So, you know, and my problem is that I see people doing these things and they're happier and healthier than everybody today.
Yeah.
So I make that point, but I think some of the issues with gluten, I believe, is not gluten. Well, nothing is evil per se. It's what we do to it, how we grow it, and what we do to it that makes it problematic. But at the same time, we've seen a massive degradation in gut ecology as well. And if your gut, as you know, and you'll be talking to people about this, I'm sure, when your gut ecology is down, you have no chance whatsoever of digesting your foods, and particularly your tougher foods, you know, not problematic but tougher, like gluten and casein in dairy, protein in wheat. So problem is there's a very big difference when you start, if you want to talk about how to handle them and how they behave differently, they behave very differently. Let's take an organic, well, for a start, you need to know what wheat flour you're working with. Okay, is that the kind of thing you want me to answer?
Yeah, I guess... So
it's quite a discussion.
Yeah, it's pretty massive.
It's not just a conversion, and it's not just a simple conversion of a wheat flour for this flour.
Yeah, because a lot of people...
Is conversion what you want to talk about?
Yeah, a lot of people want to start using more easily digestible... I mean, given the fact that there is digestive stress from gut ecology,
absolutely,
all those things, it is an issue for a lot of people.
All right, so conversion.
Yeah, we want to be able to pull out Grandma's recipe book or Jamie Oliver's recipe book and still be able to use them to a certain extent.
Always the best, the most favourite class in the chef training program. And what I'd like to say is I'll go through this briefly, but it's very much in depth in the whole food baking book.
Exactly, which
and it takes a while to get your head around it. With wheat flour, whether it be standard or organic, you need to know what wheat flour you're dealing with. Is it baker's flour, which is high percentage? So the percentage of protein impacts on your end result. So with protein or with gluten, when you add liquid to gluten and agitate it, so stir it, knead it, play with it, you develop gluten. That's great for bread because you want great elasticity for bread or pasta, but in baking you don't. You'll end up with a brick. So you need to know what protein flour you've got. Now, the general all-purpose wheat flour you see on a supermarket shelf, albeit organic, is generally a medium percentage. It's an all-purpose flour, so it's about 10 to 12%. Baker's flour for pasta or pizza, that kind of thing, is about 14% protein. And pastry flour or cake flour, though we tend to see more cake flour in Australia rather than pastry. Pastry is about 9%, cake flour is about 6 to 8%. But in Australia, we tend to see more cake flour at about 8%, so it's in between cake and pastry.
Yeah.
So you need to know what you're converting. Most recipes that you will see in Australia when you're looking at the Woman's Weekly or something like that, or Grandma, will be an all-purpose flour. So my favourite go-to flour is spelt. As you know, I love spelt. It's more water-soluble, it's more digestible, it has enough gluten to behave exactly like wheat, but it's in a different ratio and it's easier to digest. I love it. So number one, let me just take a step back. You have to understand each flour as well that you're going to convert. You need to. So if I'm using spelt, my immediate understanding will be, okay, let's say I've got 150 grams of, the recipe has 1 cup, let's leave it at 1 cup. Your recipe has 1 cup of white all-purpose wheat flour. Now that's going to weigh out at around about 150 grams, and you also need to really get an understanding of what flours weigh averagely as well. Yeah. That's another conversation. So for me, I just go 150 grams, great. White spelt flour, 1 cup of white spelt flour weighs out averagely at 130 grams. But that recipe that's made for that 1 cup of wheat flour all purpose that weighs at 150 grams is taking into account a higher gluten level. Mm-hmm. So it's got more robust leavening and it's got more liquid. So when I replace 1 cup of white spelt, 1 cup of white wheat flour, I replace it with 150 grams, so 20 grams more of spelt flour that will help. I don't have to change the leavening and I don't have to change the liquid. And it usually works. You might have to play with it, but that's what I do. That's the bottom kind of line of it.
Yeah.
And it's quite easy to replace spelt with wheat and wheat with spelt, vice versa. It's quite an easy thing to do once you get that idea and understand that aspect of it. When you come to low gluten flours like barley and oat, which are still gluten, the oat is I know it's got a big debate around it, but I'd always put it in the low gluten range. Then you're in an entirely different playing field. Because it's not going to hold together, it's not going to rise as much. So you need to consider things about how you're going to leaven it, how you're going to bind it, and you just can't keep adding baking powder. And honestly, for me, how are you going to lighten it? And for me, that is always going to be, if I can get them to work, eggs, or creaming butter and sugar and incorporating air physically as well as chemically, a la baking powder. Beating egg and sugar to the ribbon, separating the egg yolk and whipping egg whites.
I do that with coconut flour recipes to get a bit of lightness. Yeah,
you do. Yeah, well, coconut flour's heavy as brick.
Yeah.
So you need to understand. So it's not a hit and miss thing. Well, you can do it as a hit and miss thing, but it's going to cost you lots of money in wasted ingredients, and it's going to give you grief. The more you can start to understand each flour, it's like children. You have to understand your different children because one will love hot food, another one will like colder food. You just have to understand how they behave, and then you can sit down and think it out. And as I said, it's quite a large conversation. I'd recommend that I go into it in some detail in whole food baking. But today, the first thing that you can do, talking to everybody here today, that will make a huge difference on your path of learning and understanding conversion, is every time you buy a new batch of flour, whether it's spelt, keep a little book and find an average measure, write what brand it is, like Bob's Red Mill or Demeter Mills or Kayala, and do 2 or 3 cups and get an average weight and write it in your little book and what date it was. What you will see then is over a couple of years of doing this, for example, white spelt, some batches will weigh 115, some will weigh 125, some will weigh 140. It's the nature of this industry. It's not standardised. Wheat is standardised. Organic, all the other grain industries are not standardised. And for me now, no matter what, I always weigh spelt at 130 gram. I don't even bother now about averaging it out. And it gives you a control that when you want to start, you know, it also helps you maintain integrity in a recipe. So if a recipe is calling for a cup of white spelt flour, if your white spelt flour weighs 115 gram this batch, your recipe is going to behave very differently than if you've got a batch that's weighing 135 grams.
Yeah.
So that will give you, once you get that done, you can go, right, this is my average. Now, you might have to find a different average from me. It doesn't matter. As long as you start getting a picture in your mind that 1 cup of wheat all-purpose flour is going to be 150 grams, and then you can start thinking, okay, if I increase it by 20 grams, which is, I can't remember what ratio that is right now, but you making up for the lack of gluten and it's going to absorb more liquid, and it just makes conversion across everything so much easier.
I love that. That's great. Because a lot of people want to start baking with different flours and start experimenting.
It's fabulous.
But as you say, it is a costly exercise if you don't put a little bit of science behind it.
Absolutely. And it just gets so much easier. And we saw this I see it every year in conversion class in the chef training, where the more the girls or the students understand how the flours behave, the easier it is to sit down and look at the recipe and think it through and convert it in your head and get within 1 or 2 shots of getting it right.
Yeah, that's it. Well, that's how I developed my short crust gluten-free. It was thinking about the lightness, the density, the binding and the thing, and that's why I ended up with 4 flours.
Yeah. Well, funny you should say that, because Mum was at quilting the other day and one of the ladies there was saying, oh, you know, Jude's got this gluten-free recipe and it's got all these different flours in it. And invariably when you're making a gluten-free mix, what you need to do is you need to develop the flavour profile you want and the texture profile that you want. So let's say, for example, you want to do a muffin. Well, classic 2-cup mix for me would probably be 1¼ cups of brown rice flour, because it doesn't have much flavour. I want a lightly flavoured end result. So I do brown rice flour, but too much of that's going to be too heavy. I want a bit more protein in there, so I'm going to do 1/4 cup of quinoa, but I might do 1/8 cup of quinoa and 1/8 cup of teff. I'm in love with teff, let me tell you. It rocks. Flavour, no flavour, just moist, delicious, soft. I'll do 1/4 cup of desiccated coconut or nuts, ground up, so there's something small and fatty that can get in between everything. And I'll do 1/4 cup of a starch, a light starch, and I like true arrowroot because it's nutrient rich and it's a nice light starch. But that's very different to doing, say, a pumpkin scone, where you can put assertive herbs in it and pumpkin. You can even put cheese if you want. But that flour mix would be more, and it doesn't have to rise as high. It's a scone, so it can be a little bit denser crumb in the mouth as well. So I might go buckwheat, which is quite an assertive flavour, quinoa. I'll still lighten it with a bit of cornstarch, because cornstarch behaves differently to true arrowroot, gives a bit of moisture into it. So you can see whenever you exactly what you were doing when you are talking gluten-free world, you're putting together your flours to form a flavour profile that you want and a texture profile, or crumb profile, I should say, that you want.
Beautiful. And now moving into sugars.
Yes.
Now, are there better or worse sugars to be using in the world of natural unrefined, in your opinion? Can you give us a little rundown?
Yeah, look, I think that also it depends a lot of where we live. We live in Australia. My favourites in whole world, in whole sugars, as least refined as possible. I'm a big Rapadura fan, cane sugar. It's got everything in it. I love it. It's not usable in every single situation. I do use semi-refined sugars from time to time, and that is sugars that don't have all that molasses still left in them. But that's the Billingtons in Australia range.
Yep.
But there's still that whole sugar, just with more of that goodness spun off, whereas things like generic raw sugar will be bleached, or it will be white sugar with bits added back to it. So, okay, but Rapadura I love, honey I love. I tend not to heat honey as much. Ayurvedically, they consider that you shouldn't do that, but I have to say I'm slightly shifting on that. Talking to a few Ayurvedic, I think that the answer that I get from that, talking to a couple of Ayurvedic practitioners, is that if there is a toxin in the honey, that the heat will release it. And I've also been, the other one is that it causes armour, it causes, can't think, blockage is not the right word, but it causes congested, but, and there's I don't know, I'm just kind of relaxing a little bit on that. Maple syrup I love, but it's expensive because we're importing it, but mind you, import most of it. Love maple syrup. I really love it, but it's very different. It's fragrant, and you always need to understand when you're cooking what that ingredient is. Like knowing your children. Again, you need to. And maple syrup is not appropriate in all circumstances. It's very fragrant. I love it in dessert work.
Yeah, me too.
Love it. Maple sugar's wonderful, but way too expensive here in Australia. But I use it a lot in the US. It's just gorgeous. It's just more dehydrated. I love coconut palm sugar. I love palm sugar. It's not, the new saviour sent to deliver us, as some of the food fads at the moment would have us believe. It's just another sap. And basically that's where we get most of our sweetness from, other than honeys, or in most cases, not all, sap. And we boil that sap down to get rid of some of the water, because when you've got water and sugar, sucrose or fructose or whatever is going to go off. So my maple syrup, didn't have enough room in the fridge, that's all got mouldy. That's why we take the water off it and you dehydrate it down to a granule, because then it doesn't go off. I love brown rice syrup. Love it.
Me too. For caramelising, there is none
it's
other.
Just wonderful. I just love it. And that's maltose based, really body compatible. Don't use barley malt. Really, I think that's a tad old fashioned now, and it's very strong in flavour. So they're kind of my favourites. What I don't like agave. Never have been a fan of agave, and I just think it's a bullshit story.
It's just clever marketing for an
very
excess product from the tequila industry, basically.
Loathe xylitol. It's just, and I think one of the things, sugar's a really good example of everything that's wrong with how we're approaching food at the moment in our very fractionalised approach to what's wholesome. Is, you get this thing, well, sugar's bad. Well, you take anything and you refine everything off it and then bleach it. And, it's no shit that it's not going to work in your body. And excuse my language, I'm relaxing a little bit. I apologise.
Old mate's cup of tea,
It's no surprise that it's not going to work in your body. And at the moment in Australia, you and I work in an area where we see or talk to people that are vaguely interested, or at the very least vaguely interested. But it's very easy to forget that that's probably only maximum 8% of Australia. The rest of Australia is eating nothing but sugar all day in the form of refined sugar and refined white flour, which breaks down to sugar. So this idea that sugar's evil, xylitol is not. Xylitols are highly processed, extremely highly processed. There's nothing remotely natural about it. It might be from the cellulose that it started off in one era, but it's highly processed and not absorbed by the gut. And
so can I just interrupt there, Jude, because rice malt syrup cops a huge flagging for being processed as well. But I don't see rice malt syrup as being any more processed than, say, a fermented vegetable, in the sense that you're taking a starch and
you're breaking it down.
It's actually a very simple.
Can I say that it's like everything? You can buy real rice syrups and you can buy more processed rice syrups.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a Spiral fan, as I'm sure you know, Spiral Foods, and you have access to a lot more of them on the East Coast where they're based, but truly they are beautiful foodstuffs. There is no comparison to their brown rice syrup or called rice syrup that is made in the traditional manner, you know, of adding enzymes and breaking down that, to how many of the others are made. And it's a bit like, you know, xylitol too, you taking the cellulose and breaking it down.
Yeah.
And I think you people really need to understand this, is that the world, one of the things in Whole Foods that we're doing is actually, you're kind of like living in the Matrix. I love the Matrix movie. But it's kind of like living in the Matrix, where what you're doing is you're searching for the original. Most foods now are an illusion.
Yeah.
You know, they are an absolute illusion. There are traditional, and we call them artisanal now, but it's how things used to be made by hand generally, or with very simple kind of equipment. And as we've progressed and learnt all sorts of different things, you know, we can fake a lot of that or hurry it up by using other techniques, and it's not the same. So one of the things as you go along your journey, is you actually start to seek out the real version of that food that you're interested in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And brown rice syrup is no different.
Yeah.
So yeah, don't like agave, wouldn't touch xylitol. Personally, I'm not a fan of stevia, not because it's not bad, I just don't need it, and I don't like it really.
I don't like suffering for health, and to me,
I don't believe
stevia
you
and
should
the
have to
taste
suffer
of
for health.
stevia is suffering. I actually think
but that's kind of
torture.
Worse than you end up in a more stressful situation than where you started.
You don't even enjoy the treat because you're suffering through it. Yeah.
I've grown up on white flour and white sugar, and I don't have even that from time to time is not the end of the world, you know? It's like, you just got to chill a little bit. And so, yeah, I'm not a fan of, not mad about stevia. I think that's about it, really.
Okay.
Yeah. I think more and more, and that's definitely going to be a lot more in the new book. That's the one that why I forgot us today. Head down at the moment is just taking things a lot more simply. You know, you just really need a few simple good things in your pantry. Oh, I tell you what I love as a sweetener, vinacotto.
Oh, yes.
Oh, God.
And even something as simple as a peach blended through a salad dressing.
Big fan of that. Yeah. Big fan of that.
Yeah.
Love fruit as sweetness as well. Absolutely. Yeah, with you totally. Yeah. Yeah, but vinacotto, oh my God, rocks. You know, traditionally made, that really proper Italian imported artisanal vinacotto. Very good.
Yeah. Just some for me, some for the recipe.
Exactly. That's right.
So, you know, we could talk for hours. I think I might have to get you back at some stage, because I would love to have a bit of a GMO chat with you.
Oh, yes, I love a GMO.
Yeah. I think we should do that. But for today and for this chat that we've had about kind of stocking that pantry and talking conversions, starting to think about baking a little bit more scientifically so that we don't go...
You have to. Look, you just absolutely have to.
You do.
Baking is definitely a science. But having said that, you know, baking is a science. It's also a lot of intuition, because science likes variables. Or it's actually quantum science, because science as we know it today likes very little variables. It likes it everything. And that's what standardised white flour and sugar allows you to do.
Yeah.
When you do move in to converting baking and more whole food baking, you have to kind of get a bit quantum. And sometimes it's not about the science. It's about that you just know that this is what this flour needs. It just responds in like, it's like, I know it's going to sound a bit trippy, not to you, I'm sure, because we're like this, but it's as if, because you're using I'm always using organic or biodynamic ingredients closer to their natural state. It's like they still have that life force intact and they're still connected in some way. And it's like it's not just about the science or the way things behave on the earth plane. It's about how they kind of just link into the energies of other things as well.
It's true.
Fascinating.
It really is. And
yeah.
I think, you can sound a bit woo-woo. And
Yeah,
quite frankly, a lot of people out there might be thinking, whoa, she just went somewhere. But I have to say, when you're looking at that same recipe that you made last week and all of a sudden the batter's behaving differently, you have to then take your own intelligence into account and say that batter today needs an extra egg. It just
you
does.
Absolutely have to do that. But that's also being a cook.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the most important things about cooking is that you, and particularly being a baker, is that you need to assess what that child needs. No?
Yeah.
And how many times do we do that as parents? You need to assess what that child needs on that day.
Yeah.
And you do that by knowing your child or knowing your ingredient.
I love that. And when there's still that life force through the ingredients because you're using organic and biodynamic, it is a living thing and it will respond differently.
Absolutely. And
seasonal, all the other variables come into account. Yeah.
You've got to be lateral.
I love that.
Yeah.
Now, a little parting Jude wisdom?
Oh, don't know.
Okay, what could you share?
A little parting wisdom.
Yes.
Okay, I would say, no, I do know what I'd like to say, is I'd like to say chill a little bit.
Yeah.
Relax. Celebrate life. We're so lucky. Look at what's happened this year. I know that when I die and I'm on my deathbed, I'm not going to be thinking about fanaticizing about this ingredient or that vitamin or mineral. I'll remember right now, the beautiful plum rustic tart that I made to take and we had for dinner. It's my niece's birthday and my daughter will be there and the family will be there, and that we have eaten food that is delicious, that has nourished us and enabled us to become all that we can be, but it's been joyful and delicious. And you know what? If that means that I might have used a semi-refined sugar in that because I want the clearer taste of the plum to come through, but there's not heaps on it, then you know what? The world is not going to fall apart.
Yeah.
And I might serve a cultured cream with that. Or I might have got some buttermilk ice cream in the freezer that I made. I might serve that with it. But include joy and deliciousness in your life and relax a little bit about it all.
I love that. That is so wonderful because I think a lot of people find it hard to draw a line between the normalisation of a cupcake with fake blue icing at 8:30 in the morning for a child or after a 9:30 soccer match, fake lollies. That is a different kettle of fish to enjoying a slice of pavlova at Christmas. It's
exactly, but that's also the drawing your line
Yeah.
question as well. And you'll start to, when you first start on the journey, that's kind of like a really great place to draw your line. No fake colours, no fake ingredients, no chemicals, that kind of thing. But as you go along the journey, your line changes, and as you learn more and you understand more, that line will change for you.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing with us
today. Such a pleasure. It's lovely to meet you all here today.
Yay. And I'll speak to you real soon.
All right. Thanks.
Okay, bye.